It's the Growing for Market podcast.
Where is storage farming, or in what context is storage farming a good option to help farmers who are either running into workload problems or income problems? And I think it's especially useful for the case where you are labor and time limited and not as land limited. You know, if you're Ben Hartman and you only have a third of an acre available to you, storage crops they're not going to make you a living. You know, they're just not valuable enough on a weight basis and a space basis. But if you're farming 1 or 2 acres and you've got a little extra space and you can't get the summer labor that you need to crunch out all those summer CSA crops or market crops, storage farming or storage crops don't take as much work to tend in the summertime, but they do require that extra space.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing vegetables and flowers for local markets like farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands, and local wholesaling. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine for 34 years, the magazine for flower and vegetable market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. I am so excited to welcome Bootstrap Farmer as a sponsor of the podcast. I've known them for a dozen years, and if anyone tells you nothing is made in the USA anymore, well, they're headquartered and warehoused in Paris, Texas. They make their own all-metal, all-inclusive greenhouse frames of steel made in the USA and fabricated in Texas. And their heavy-duty, reusable propagation and microgreens trays are Midwest-made. With a complete range of supplies, they have just about everything for propagation and growing, including heat mats, ground cover, frost blankets, silage tarps, irrigation, and trellising. Want to color code your seed starting flats? They've got heavy-duty trays that will last for years in a full range of colors. Great for keeping farm seedlings separate from retail or just for fun. And they have an experienced team of growers to support everything they sell. If you've heard of the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative providing grants for hoop houses, but have been put off by the paperwork, Bootstrap Farmer has a guide that will walk you through the application process so you can get your hoop house funded this winter. For all that and more, check out Bootstrap Farmer at bootstrapfarmer.com. If you're looking for something new in vegetables, those novel, high-quality varieties that appeal to today's fresh market shoppers, then it's time to explore Pan American Seed vegetables. Pan American Seed offers vegetable varieties that are specially selected for earlier and longer harvests with loads of flavorful produce to sell, better disease resistance, and plant habits that fit smaller, more versatile growing spaces. To help make your choices for vegetable programs easier, Pan American Seed has grouped its full catalog assortment into 4 categories using easy-to-identify symbols. There's basket bites for trailing vegetables, patio picks for large containers, ground breakers with in-the-ground plant performance, and finally, kitchen minis, which are compact tabletop herbs and veggies for small space growing. Download the latest Pan American Seed vegetables brochure at panamseed.com/vegetables and reach out to your preferred seed supplier to place your order today. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Sam Knapp to the Growing for Market podcast. Sam runs Offbeet Farm in Fairbanks, Alaska, that has a somewhat unusual sales and marketing model of growing produce that can be stored in the summer specifically for sales through the long Alaska winter, which makes a lot of sense because Sam just wrote a book that will be out this November called Beyond the Root Cellar, The Market Gardener's Guide to Growing and Storing Vegetables for Off-Season Sales and Food Security. Now, this makes a lot of sense to me because Sam has written for Growing for Market magazine for a number of years, shockingly mostly about storage crops. His articles included a multi-part series about how to design and build a long-term storage facility, and we're going to link to the first article in that series in the show notes so everyone can read it. Sam's articles really stood out to me because it's a pretty technical subject, and Sam's articles were always well-researched, detailed, and clear. So I was not at all surprised when he told me he wrote a book on the topic. If you want to read more about long term veg storage, Sam wrote an article about how to tackle condensation in walk in coolers in the October magazine. And we're going to have an excerpt from Sam's book in the November December magazine. And if you're still going after all that, you might want to get his book. It's currently on pre-sale at growingformarket.com, where, as always, current subscribers get 20% off the book when they're logged into the website. Books will ship in late November as soon as we get them from the publisher Chelsea Green. So, without further ado, Sam, welcome to the Growing for Market podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. This is exciting. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, good. Well, we're so happy to have you. In fact, as I was doing my homework for this interview, I think you've got articles in Growing for Market going back to 2019 or 2020. So it's kind of fun. We've been working together for a while now. It is fun to finally see you face to face, even though we are probably more than 3,000 miles apart in that I am in Maine, you are in Alaska. Still blows my mind that I can be sitting having a real-time conversation somehow or another over those kind of distances, but it is fun. So we're very excited to have you. And I did want to ask you a little bit about your farm, of course. Am I correct that you don't sell produce in the summertime when you're growing it?
That is correct. Maybe with the exception of garlic scapes, which are just a natural product that come from garlic that we grow here. So
right, of course. Those got to get them off there, because I think the bulbs will get bigger if you pop those scapes off, as probably a lot of people listening to this podcast know. So yeah, you pretty much got to get rid of them then, unless you're going to make preserve them. What are they called? I had somebody make the solution that they use for dilly beans, but they put garlic scapes in it instead. Those were really good. But that's a whole,
that's a whole
nother,
delicious.
yeah, it really was. But that's a whole nother can of worms. So in that case, when and what are your markets like?
Yeah. So I begin selling in mid-October and basically sell until my root cellar is empty, and that usually I shoot for the end of April to be fully sold out of what I'm going to sell for the year. That's when outdoor temperatures are beginning to rise again, and I don't want to have to fire my coolers back up. I sell about 75% of sales are through a CSA, which runs November through March. And this year we've got 140 families in it. And then the other 25% is kind of a mix of a scattering of markets and wholesale.
Are you ever tempted to do summer sales, or is it just so nice to be able to say, like, first we grow, then we sell, that you just like stick to the plan?
I am tempted. I think if I do crack into the summer marketplace, I'm going to be intentional and focus on just one thing. My wife actually just started going to markets with fish. She's been starting a partnership with a friend who lives on the coast in Cordova, a commercial fisherman, and helping him market his fish into the interior of Alaska. So she's already going to market, and it presents an opportunity to specialize in something. And what that is, we are yet to decide. Maybe strawberries, maybe something like asparagus.
But that does sound like a really nice distribution of labor amongst other things, right? Because when we were doing, we don't do the farmers market anymore, but when we did, of course, there's this whole pressure of you're spending so much time working on the farm, and then you got to drop everything, harvest for the weekend, and then spend a lot of your Saturday, in our case, at a farmer's market. So is that a good balance? And remind us how many years you've been doing that there in Alaska, and tell us if the balance is as good as it sounds like it might be.
Yeah. So I started this farm in 2020. So we're going on the fourth year of production here. Before that, I was doing a pretty similar operation in Michigan for 3 years. So I do think the balance is good. It allows me to, I think, cultivate a lot more acreage or a lot more space by myself or nearly by myself than I could otherwise. So the farm is hovering just about an acre, and crazily in the first couple of years I was doing that entirely by myself. I've since added a part-time helper, somebody who comes 10 to 15 hours a week during the summer. But it's pretty minimal amount of labor for the amount of space that we're growing in, and the only way that we can do that is because we're not selling. All that time that you spend prepping for going to taking down markets, I can put that time towards growing a crop, or better yet, recouping and enjoying myself on evenings and weekends.
Yeah, there's definitely some value in that. I know there's so much emphasis on lengthening the season. I know,
Yeah.
when we were selling produce at farmers markets, we built hoop houses and we're trying to grow greens all winter long. And then we were kind of like, wait a minute, we like, when do we get to recharge? Because some of our formative experiences were working on farms out on the West Coast in California and Washington State, where they have a very mild climate, and we worked for a lot of farmers who just were burned out because they could grow all year long, and so they were, and they never got a break. And we were like, okay, let's not do that, only to come back east and immediately start growing year round and burning ourselves out. So work life balance is a real thing. It seems like it would be a definite advantage if you can make it work out, like hopefully you are. And do you have the market cornered on produce in the wintertime, or almost so? I mean, it seems like, as you point out in the book, is this not a sales and marketing model that it seems like a lot of people are doing? I mean, obviously there are some people doing it, but it seems like a vast minority are doing summer farming for winter sales.
Yeah, totally. In my local area, I do have the market cornered. There's one other grower or a couple growers in town who do potatoes only, but as far as like a diverse set of storage crops, I'm the only one. And it's a nice thing, but at the same time, I'm only just scratching the surface of the demand. And so I think this community and many others could support a large range of people storing crops and selling crops into the
Hmm.
winter.
Well, and you've just given them the blueprint.
Yeah, I mean those summer market growers, they don't go anywhere come wintertime, or the folks attending the summer markets, they don't move away.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, the more I was thinking about your book, I started to think about how storage is the other side of this season extension coin. And what I mean by that is, one of the challenges of growing the local food movement has been that in most locations, there's some part of the year that is not conducive to field growing. So in the north, that's the winter when it's too cold to grow. For places in the deep south, it may actually be the height of the summer, as it may be too hot to grow. And there are some special places where you can grow outside year round, but those are the minority. So as I was reading your book, I was thinking about how much attention season extension gets as far as hoop houses and greenhouses stretching out local food season. And I was thinking about how comparatively little attention storage farming gets as far as stretching local food season compared to season extension. And I am optimistic that your book will spark a new wave of interest in storing crops to stretch out local food season. And I want to pose a question to you that you ask in your introduction, which is, if storage farming has so much potential, why aren't more people doing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start by saying that I don't know the answer, but I can pose a few ideas, as to why storage farming has gotten this figurative backseat. I think a big one is that it requires a level of infrastructure, and those things cost money and take time to set up, and that can be an intimidating hurdle for farmers who are looking from the other side of the fence, thinking about getting into it. I think that also storage farming carries an additional level of risk compared to what most farmers are doing. So not only do you have to produce a crop, but you have to bring it into storage and hope that it can last until it's time to sell it, which is scary. I mean, I remember when I was starting out, that was like the big question, is like, is everything going to rot in storage?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. It's a big investment. On the other hand, the more I think about it, it's very so similar to greenhouse farming, which I'm really into greenhouses. And so when I think about, like, same thing, you got to build the structure. I guess there's not the sort of like investment aspect where you've just like banked presumably a whole year's worth of income, and if it doesn't last, you're kind of up a creek.
Yeah, you're kind of cooked.
But it just makes me think about how I really think there is a lot of potential. And I do think that part of the reason people haven't executed on it is because you don't want to take that investment unless you have a good roadmap as far as how to recoup it. For example, a number of years ago, we built a walk-in cooler on our farm that was actually a smaller version of what people up here in Maine call a potato house, in that it was sunk halfway below grade. Part, of course, we were trying to save on energy, and so of course the idea is that it was partway sunk in the ground, and then actually we buried it, which is pretty standard up here. You may know Maine is a big potato growing state, and it also gets very cold up here in the winter. So it's not uncommon to see the potato growers out around here to have these structures that are bunkered, either into a hillside or covered in soil, more like we did. So ours was concrete and then has a lot of soil on top for insulation, and we had heaters and coolers to keep it in the right range. But we had to do so much homework. We even got the state to work with us, because there parts of the state department of ag had worked with potato growers building these potato houses, but still it felt like we were having to figure it out ourselves. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about your book. If we had waited a decade, we could just read your book, because there are so many technical specifications in there, not only about what conditions each crop needs to store, but also what kind of insulation, what kind of structure, what kind of heaters or coolers, how you prevent condensation, all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited that you have your book as a resource going forward. This is in the book, but since it's not out yet, can you tell the audience a bit about how you got so interested in storage crops in the first place?
Yeah, it was really a product of circumstance. So I was finishing up a term as an AmeriCorps volunteer where I was living on a reservation in Wisconsin, and I was, oh man, being run to the ground as all AmeriCorps volunteers are, managing a farmer's market and a community garden and kind of treating it as a market garden and doing farm to school and all this stuff. And the term was coming to an end, or it was about to come to an end. And so the question was what was next. And I ended up getting a graduate position as a student, where my wife was already going to graduate school in the UP of Michigan. And the land that she was living at, it was a farm, like a 120-acre cattle farm. And they offered to let me use about a quarter acre of that, basically for free, to grow vegetables. Because I looked around, I wanted to keep farming. I looked around at the local marketplace and the local farm scene, and there weren't really any options to work for other folks. And so if I wanted to keep farming, I had to start my own. And the limitations of still living several hours away that first summer, plus in the future years when I had to be doing graduate research in the summer times, I just couldn't run a traditional farm. And at the time, I was in the Farmer to Farmer Mentor Program that's run by Marble Seed now, but it was Moses then. And my farm mentor, a guy named Brian Gronsky from near Green Bay, Wisconsin, he suggested that I do a winter CSA. And I thought, at the time I thought, I have no idea what this is. And he began to explain to me that, you can do storage crops in the summer, you can tend them and grow them all summer, and then sell them in the winter. And that idea was the beginning of this whole journey. So it really was, I just didn't have time to be a traditional farmer, and I needed to find another way. I mean, I was interested in doing greenhouse growing for the winter, but I was a graduate student and coming off AmeriCorps, so I had no money and didn't want to sink a bunch of permanent greenhouse infrastructure money into this place that would only be temporary. I was able to convert a space to kind of a root cellar-ish cold storage space on the cheap, and then use that as my storage space going forward.
And that farm the one that was called Root Cellar Farm?
That was Root Cellar Farm.
Okay. Yeah, well, that is so interesting. And also, I can see how, you wouldn't want to make that investment in greenhouses. But also, I would think another advantage is just that it's not the model that most people are doing. You're right. I think a lot of farmers think of like potatoes, like a couple of the crops. So I should say, one of the great things about your book is that it has this compendium of 18 storage crops, which seems like you've picked out the ones that have real potential to store for a long time. And so all the details are there. If people want to know, like when the crop needs to be harvested, post-harvest handling, temperature, humidity, like all the things for how to hold any of those crops, people can basically just go in the book and look up whatever details they need so they can make sure that they store.
I mean, what held me after the initial idea, what kind of held me in it and has kept me engaged and interested is that I was just shocked that there weren't any other growers doing this. I remember I was selling to a local co-op in Michigan, in Hancock, Michigan. And they didn't have anybody supplying locally in the wintertime. And, even though I was this tiny farm, basically they were thrilled to get anything that I could provide them. And so just this positive reinforcement, people being so excited to have an access to a winter CSA, and the co-op being so excited to get anything that I could get them. I just thought, wow, this is something bigger than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of potential here.
Yeah, I think so. I'm glad you hooked onto it, because I think, like it's weird in some way, like maybe tomatoes and baby greens and stuff like that are sexier or something. Like, I don't know
They
if I
are.
can see then.
I mean, nobody's lining up for turnips.
Right. On the other hand, a really nice winter squash or a turnip, I hesitate to use the word fresh because,
Right.
obviously it's been stored, but, one of the things that you're getting at is how to preserve the quality that a crop has on the day that it comes out of the field for months. That's the whole
Yeah.
idea, is that they're not going downhill in storage. And I know that's a lot what you talk about, is that there's infrastructure that traditional root cellars didn't have that you can use to make things store for longer. And so I think maybe greenhouse growing has a certain attraction, but that people are overlooking the potential for the winter sales, because people will buy it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the growers that I interviewed for the book, he had this great point that, carrots are a really, I guess, important crop for people looking to get into this, because it's one of those things that you really can taste the local difference. A local carrot always tastes better, even if it's stored, than a carrot coming from far away. And I think that's has a lot to do with varieties, but also, the methods we're using for storage and shipping, and the varieties that can take that. But people are going to buy carrots, local carrots, anywhere you can produce them all year.
Yeah. And they have good potential to be stored, right? Of course,
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
crops that you're talking about they all have the physiological potential. There's reasons, let's say they go dormant, or there's reasons why they can be stored like that. So it's really just a matter of understanding what those conditions are and making use of them to make them store for a long time, which is like a whole side of our local food economy that has not, I think, is clearly not being maximized. So that's one of the many reasons that I'm excited about your book. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free.
Hi, this is Nathan from Tilth Soil. We are a worker-owned co-op in Cleveland, Ohio, making living soils approved for certified organic growing. Our mixes are based on NOP-compliant compost we make from the 4,000 tons of food scraps we keep out of landfills every year. Instead of throwing food in the trash, we respect farmers and the land by putting those scraps back into production as compost. Just like quality vegetable farming, it takes hard work and dedication, but the results speak for themselves. Get excellent germination, strong transplants, and help us feed people, not landfills. Try a free bag and check out our pre-sale for the 25 season at tilthsoil.com. Okay, I'm done. Play the jingle.
I'm in my garden, the sun is shining, my plants are thriving in Tilth Soil.
Hi there, I'm Lindsay Lusher-Shute from Hardy Roots Farm. There are a lot of farm sales platforms out there, but there's only one that's cooperatively owned by farmers. That's Grown By, your all-in-one solution to simplify farm sales. From startup market farms to complex and scaled-up CSAs like mine, Grown By makes online farm sales easy and affordable. Built a beautiful storefront with our dedicated support team who have years of farming experience. They'll be with you every step of the way. Selling on Grown By is truly affordable. Setting up your shop is totally free, and you pay only when you sell. More than half of all platform and credit card processing fees are paid for by Grown By customers, helping farmers keep more cash in their own pockets. Grown By doesn't just make selling food online accessible to farmers. Grown By makes farm food accessible to all. In a partnership with the USDA and MarketLink, Grown By will help you authorize your farm to accept SNAP online for free. Ready to put your best food forward? Join over 900 farms who have already signed up for Grown By. And don't forget, you're eligible to join the co-op and become a member owner after your first sale. Visit grownby.com to get started. That's GROWNBY.com.
I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not to spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/GFM. That's farmhand.partners/GFM. And now, back to the show. You know what? As long as we're started talking about dormancy and everything,
Yeah.
a lot of the crops that you talk about in the book, there's 18 crops that you focus on. A lot of those crops enter some form of dormancy. Can you talk a bit about the different types of dormancy and how growers can use dormancy to their advantage?
Yeah. So I'd say the vast majority of storage crops enter what's been coined induced or environmental dormancy. And basically that means that the plants are responding to the conditions that are around them. They're usually responding to like reduced light, both length and intensity as the season moves on into fall, and decreasing temperatures. And they enter this state of low metabolism that I would kind of liken to hibernation. That allows at least the biennial crops and the perennials that we're growing as annuals to make it through the winter, to survive and reproduce the following year. But these crops, I think, like sweet potatoes is a good example. I think in the book I compare potatoes to sweet potatoes, that if you take a sweet potato out of storage and give it good growing conditions, it's going to grow immediately as soon as you expose it to those good growing conditions. So there are a few other crops, and potatoes and onions are good examples of this, where the dormancy is controlled by plant hormones. And once they enter that state of dormancy, they won't begin growing again until kind of cumulative exposure to these conditions triggers the release of growth hormones that start their regrowth. And so potatoes, if you take a freshly cured potato out of storage, it's not going to grow. It's going to take a while of sitting in good growing conditions before it finally starts to eke out some little sprouts. And that's actually vexed potato growers in kind of milder climates looking to get multiple crops out of the same year, that you can't just harvest potatoes and throw them back in the ground because they won't grow.
Right. Which is a defense mechanism is the wrong word, but it's a defense mechanism for the plant against starting to grow in the middle of winter, right?
Exactly.
You don't want that potato doesn't want to reach maturity and immediately sprout again, only for it to be fall and then get snowed on. So there's a reason for that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and many of the other crops, that are just doing an induced or environmental dormancy, it does take a while, like they're not immediately popping out a 1 foot shoot. It's a slow, root hairs start to poke out, and then the shoot starts to grow. So it's kind of a slow roll, and many of those are kind of the hardier crops that can take a freeze if they did begin to grow too early. Most of these crops have a storage organ, and that's usually what we're eating, that is protecting the tissues that will grow next year's growth. Like a cabbage, for example, that meristem is like buried in the middle of this pile of densely packed leaves, and that's what's going to send forth the flowering shoot the next year. Carrots this root is buried underground, and it's able to protect that meristematic tissue just at the top of the carrot to be able to survive and send forth flowers the next year.
Okay. And I think it's worth making the point that the conditions that will cause all this produce to store all winter long are the conditions that you'd want to make for that produce, even if you just want to hold them for a month or two, right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
You want to make sure that produce is not losing quality in storage. I just make that point because I think there's a lot of value in this book, whether people want to store produce all winter long or not, because it will tell people the best practices for storing produce, regardless of how long they want to store it for.
Yeah, and I think that to that point, I think kale is kind of a good example of a plant that's like on the bridge between being something that's a storage crop and something that's not. And kind of behaves similarly to other crops that you might just be storing for a short time because they're not traditional storage crops. Like kale, when you bring it into storage, as with other crops, you want to cool them as quickly as possible. With kale, as with other leafy greens, as they begin to age in storage, they're going to be releasing a little bit of ethylene gas, and that ethylene gas will trigger more deterioration and more ethylene gas being produced. And that effect just snowballs to where you can go from something that's green and fresh, and then a few days later it's yellowed, and a few days later it's turned into a pile of goop. So with kale, for example, keeping the leaves loosely packed, keeping them cold so that you can get that gas is not allowed to build up and kind of snowball into yellowing and deteriorating leaves. Kale at the same time is interesting in that, if you harvest, leaves behave differently in storage depending on how old they are going into storage. So the leaves near the bottom of the plant, the oldest leaves that have usually unfurled all their curls and might be kind of on the edge of turning a different color than the fresher leaves, those ones don't last long in storage at all. They've kind of moved through their maturation process. And the leaves, in contrast, if you harvest the leaves at the very top of the kale plant, I've seen those last for 4 months in storage. It's incredible.
Wow. Yeah, and that's so important because I think most farmers have seen how quickly produce can go downhill if it's not harvested at the right stage or stored properly. And most farms are going to end up storing produce for at least a short amount of time. So I think most farms will have something to gain by understanding what crops can be stored, the stage at which to harvest them, how to handle them post-harvest, what kind of structure to hold them in, and what temperature and humidity to hold them at in order to maximize storage, even if they don't want to go all winter long, right? Because it's the same conditions are going to make good storage, whether it's a couple months or, a couple seasons.
Yeah. Cold temperature, high humidity, and having the ability to hit the plants with that quickly.
Okay. So the first part of the book is about getting crops from the field into storage in the best shape possible. The crops you focus on are not surprising. So carrots, parsnips, and celeriac, beets, onions, garlic, leeks, and shallots. Then a bunch of brassicas, cabbage, kohlrabi, kale, winter radishes, rutabagas, turnips, and Brussels sprouts. And you also talk about sunchokes, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. So crop choice is not surprising, but just choosing from this list of crops is not enough to ensure good storage. What do people need to know about that stage of growth? Kind of like you were talking about with the kale, that will help these crops store well. And I realize if you can just talk about a few of them, because I know there's groups there. You obviously can't talk about all 18. That's what the book is for. But if you could talk a little bit more about the physiological, like how people need to plan for the crop to be at a certain physiological age before it goes into storage.
Yeah. So there are certain crops where the physiological age is really important. And I think winter squash and pumpkins is a good example of that as a non-climacteric fruit, when you harvest them, that stage of maturity is what you get. So they have to be at this stage of physiological maturity where they're done growing and they can enter dormancy. And there are a few signs, like in depending on what part of the country you're in, you can tell that they're mature. Like the stereotypical way is looking for corking stems. But, I talked with a grower in the South where it's really hot when they're harvesting squash, and they can't wait for that without having the squash turn into balls of, like hot balls of goo in the field.
Get sunburned.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay.
I think what's happening is the step between physiological maturity and overmaturity is very small in that high heat. In Alaska, I have to use similar signs, or I look for similar signs that my squash are mature, despite the fact that I'm harvesting, like I can't get corking stems in the field. We're barely eking it out. And so some of the other signs that crop or that squash are ready is when the skin or the rind forms that waxy coloring. So it will go from shiny to dull. And right around that time, the small hairs or trichomes that cover a squash start to go away. And they don't happen exactly at the same time, but those two things occurring are really good signs that your squash are ready to go to the next stage, either curing or straight into storage. Onions are another great example, or onions and garlic, kind of the bulbing alliums, are another example of crops that have to be mature when you put them into storage or start thinking about moving them further in the process. That, like onions, go through a growth phase vegetatively and then a bulbing phase where they're increasing the mass of those leaf bases into a nice bulb. And then they enter this dormancy phase where they stop putting the resources into growth, start changing the forms of carbohydrates in the plant to survive the winter. And with onions, for example, that starts to happen right around the time that the neck becomes soft. So the tops may not have fallen over, but if they're just softening up, they might be ready for harvest.
Okay, so that's why some people, obviously it varies, but next falling over naturally is sometimes a signal of maturity for onions.
Yeah, and the point there is that, again, for growers in the South where it's very hot, sometimes they can't wait for the next to fall over, or, anywhere you are, if you're hitting a large spell of wet weather, you might have fungal problems if you wait long enough for the next to fall over. So technically, they've entered that last phase of growth, the dormancy phase, when the necks begin to soften. That's the first sign.
Okay.
Most storage crops, though, can be put into storage when they're small. So maturity isn't so much of an issue as far as storage life. It's more of an issue of how much weight is this, and am I making enough money through my yields to turn a profit? Or, are my customers going to be mad because I'm giving them golf ball sized kohlrabis that they, after you're done peeling it, you have a one bite left.
Right. Yeah, there might be practical reasons why people don't want golf ball sized kohlrabi, as cute as they would be.
Yeah, exactly. So on the flip side of that, though, leaving crops overlong in the field can also be a bad thing. There are many things that tend to split when they get too large, cabbages, kohlrabis, carrots even. There are some things that get kind of pithy in the middle, like parsnips, if they're allowed to get too big. And you don't want those things to happen either. With the pithiness, that's more of a taste and aesthetics thing for the customer. But bringing a cracked carrot or a split cabbage into storage, you've opened the door for pathogens to get in and cause problems.
Right. So there's reasons besides the fact that people tend to buy with their eyes. They're not going to want a cracked carrot or cracked cabbage. There's also storage reasons why you don't want to put that into storage, because it's not going to store well. So, all right, well, that's a good point. That's why it's interesting, or it's important to understand those physiological signs in being able to evaluate your produce. Is it done enough to start the harvest process? And I imagine it's also important, like you mentioned, if, say, in the South, it may be really hot and the stuff is like squashes aren't going to do well out in the field, or like let's say you have a rainy spell coming up, and you want to know if you can get your produce out of the field, because of course, if it's going to rain for a couple weeks straight, it may start to rot. And so that's where you could use those signs and tell, like, okay, this is mature enough to get out of the field before the bad weather.
Yeah, getting any crop is better than getting nothing in that case.
Yeah. All right, you used a word a minute ago that I want to ask you about. Is it non-apopteric or something?
Oh, non-climacteric.
Yes, that. What is that?
So it's climacteric fruits are the type that will continue to mature after they're harvested. Like bananas are kind of a poster child for that.
Oh, okay.
That, you get this big flush of ethylene that snowballs their maturity, and they'll continue to develop after they're cut off the vine.
Or tomatoes, right? People
Yeah,
can harvest them
tomatoes.
half red and they'll continue finish off ripening.
Exactly. Yeah, whereas squash are not. You're never going to develop a waxy covering on the outside of a squash that's matured too early or that's harvested too early.
Right. And probably also the sweetness and flavors, right? I'm just trying to think, because we usually eat our squash ripe, but I mean, it probably doesn't have the same culinary characteristics before it's reached maturity as well.
Right. And this is where there's a little bit of gray area, because sometimes you can kind of fudge it with curing, and it's difficult to tell when a squash will survive through the curing process and develop. The curing process can help the squash develop those, sometimes the carotenoids, that like deep orange color, and develop the sugars that it needs to last longer in storage. But sometimes it can't, and it's difficult to tell whether or not it's crossed that line of maturity. So oftentimes I'll just throw them into the curing process, and it's obvious if they don't make it. They'll shrivel, they'll turn punky, they'll turn soft. Whereas some make it, and they store just fine.
Okay. What about ground spot? Do you have, how I think a lot of people, or at least we did, would turn squashes over, and when they were immature, the spot where it sits on the ground, people may have noticed that doesn't tend to get the pigment like the rest of the squash. And I used to think that when squash was immature, the ground spot would be kind of like almost white or a very pale yellow color. And a lot of the varieties we were growing, once they reached maturity, they would get more like a darker orange color. Is that useful?
Yeah, absolutely. One other useful thing is, if you have enough squash that you feel you can sacrifice some, is to cut into them and take a look at the seeds. If the seeds have begun to plump out, then the squash is ready. Whereas, they start to look viable, like the kind you would get in a packet. But if they're thin and you think there's no way if I threw this in the ground this would ever germinate, then the squash is not ready.
Oh, right. Of course, because the squash doesn't realizing that it's growing for us to eat it. Is the squash wants to pass on its genes, and so that makes sense. Is that it would reach physiological maturity when the seeds are also mature and viable,
ready to grow,
filled out. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. All right. So you devote a whole chapter to harvest. Can you just hit some of the high points on what growers need to know when it comes to harvesting with storage in mind?
Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time talking about maturity. So of course you want the crops to be mature, and that's specific for what it is. You also want them to be entering in the best condition possible. And so if you have disease issues in your field, those things tend to balloon quickly into problems in storage. So if you have a disease problem, those crops you're going to want to sell right now rather than putting them into storage, because those issues get larger and larger over time. As you're handling them, bringing them into harvest and through processing, maybe you're doing upfront washing, you want to be careful about not bruising them, not nicking them. Those are the types of things, like a bruise on a beet can turn into a breeding ground for mold in storage. So you want to be careful with them. And for northern growers, a big issue is kind of fighting this onset of cold weather. There are some crops that we want to get exposed to frosts, and there are others that, depending on the severity of the frost, you're kind of towing the line of damaging it. And this is where there's a lot of debate, and there's a lot of information out there about how much cold can these crops actually take. And I think it comes from observation that if you, let's say it gets down to 26 or 27 degrees some morning, and you've got your daikon radishes out in the field, when you walk out in the field in the morning and everything is crispy, they look pretty sad. But if you wait later in the day, the sun is out, things warm up, they do perk back up, and those roots aren't going to turn into goo at any point soon. And so you may think okay, this is good, this is ready to go for storage. If a crop has been freeze damaged at all like that, though, in storage, the damage or the cell damage that they've sustained in that freezing is enough to kind of I'd say hasten them coming out of dormancy, or kind of like hasten the end of their storage life once they're in storage. So like that daikon radish that's been frozen and then thawed may look fine for a time, but it's not going to last its full storage life. And I would even argue that it's going to have a funny texture that customers may notice and may not like. So, I mean, that's just one example, but you're always kind of, with northern growers especially, harvesting before crops are damaged by cold is a big thing.
Yeah, so take home messages, keep an eye on the weather. If there's damaging weather on the horizon, best get the crops out of the field before that happens. Because, I mean, it seems like one of the big messages here is things never get better in storage. You're doing is preserving the quality that went in as long as possible, right? So I think the point here is that if you put, it's like that computer thing, garbage in, garbage out. If you put damaged crops into storage, they might hold better than it sitting in the field, but they're never going to hold as well as crops that were in really good shape going in. Like you can't make up for damage or like cold damage, pathogen damage, or any of those kinds of things. And so that's kind of what I was getting at as far as how to harvest with storage in mind.
Yeah, and I mean there may also be other factors that kind of affect your harvest speed that you might want to keep an eye on. You know, if it's going to be really wet and a really wet spell is coming up and you have kind of silty or clay soils, you know, that might slow down your carrot or parsnip harvest by a factor of 2 or 3. It will make it very miserable to get those crops out of the ground and then put you behind for other things.
Yeah.
So, you know, in addition to damage, you kind of have to, oftentimes I say in the book, like as George R.R. Martin told us, winter is coming. And that is a fact that we are always fighting as storage farmers, that you need to give yourself time to get these things out of the field and do all the washing and curing that you need to do before they go into storage.
Yes. And that's, you can always say that winter is coming because it always is. It just depends on how much time you have.
Yep.
And whether White Walkers are coming with it or not, but that's another
hopefully not. Yeah.
So this reminded me, there's this ongoing debate, I feel like, in farming about whether to wash crops like carrots and potatoes and parsnips and things like that, or not wash them before going into storage. What is your take on that?
So I think it's very context dependent. And let's say that a grower has an adequate refrigeration system, that they can cool the crops quickly post-storage and keep them at the best storage temperatures, right around freezing or whatever they need to be stored at. Then I think that they can make the decision whether to wash or not based upon like their setup and when they can do it most efficiently. I think if you don't have a good way to cool crops quickly, or your storage conditions tend to be a little on the warm side, that, you know, the kind of this more traditional advice of don't wash crops before you put them into storage, there is truth to it, because when you wash them, you're introducing all these possibilities for damage, nicks. You know, you're sometimes adding a bunch of moisture that you're putting into storage, and these are all things that can fester, kind of leave the door open for pathogens to get involved. And if the temperatures in storage are too warm, they're just going to grow more quickly.
Uh-huh.
So if you're nailing conditions, I think you can wash whenever is most efficient for you, especially if you have a winter washing setup. But otherwise, so you can make the decision based upon what works well for your workload.
Well, that's a good answer in a way, because it could be either. It's,
exactly.
if you have time and you have the right storage conditions, you can go ahead and wash. But that lets people know, on the other hand, if they don't have the time or they don't have the right storage conditions, they can also just harvest them dirty and wash. Because I've also known people who have been very successful at that, of washing gradually through the course of the winter when they need to sell stuff, instead of stocking it all the way washed.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be a trade-off no matter what you do. And like using carrots as an example, if you wash everything up front, let's say that's your most efficient way to do it, then the root tips tend, like if you're washing in, let's say September or October, by the time you've reached February and March, those little tiny root tips coming off the end of the carrots have usually turned an off color, slight browning. They've shriveled, they don't look good, and you need to cut them off. So you can't just toss carrots into a bag and send them off to your customers because they look bad.
Uh-huh.
So you need to do a bunch of trimming if you're going to be washing on the front end. On the flip side of that, if you have like silty or clay soils and you are waiting till February to wash, you're going to have soil staining that you have to deal with. And maybe you have to employ a brush washer to, in addition to whatever washing technique you're using, to get those stains off, or you just have to sell stained carrots.
Okay. So like most things in farming and life, it's complicated. There's multiple factors,
absolutely.
but at least that you're talking about the all the different factors. And actually, you're just talking about wanting to be careful with the produce as you're harvesting. It reminds me of one picture that you have in the book where one of the farmers is using a boogie board to cushion the carrots. I think in the picture that it's coming off a AZS rinse conveyor or some kind of brush washer or something. Yeah. And so you're talking about the importance of not bruising the produce while you're handling it. And it shows them using a boogie board as basically to ramp or, keep the carrots from falling directly on the other carrots going into a bin. Is, like give them a ramp, give them a smooth landing. So that was a really funny image to me, but also, it's very useful. It's a good, it reminds me you got to be careful with everything. So maybe we can work up some GFM clickbait around the boogie board. It's like one weird trick. Why a boogie board is going to be your best farming tool this season. So I don't know. We'll send it over to the GFM clickbait department, see what we can do with that.
Yeah. I think there's good potential there.
Yeah. All right. Well, once everything is harvested, there are some post-harvest best practices for storage. Can you talk a bit about what growers want to keep in mind for preparing vegetables to go into storage?
Yeah. I think there is something to say about the importance of cooling crops quickly. In the process of my research, I came across this really interesting study that looked at how long it takes for veggies to cool down to remove the field heat from them. And they were looking at putting in a full macro bin. And for those who don't know, a macro bin is like a pallet-sized plastic vented container that usually can hold like 700 or 800 pounds of carrots or beets or whatever you're talking about. So a full macro bin of veggies, if you're taking it from, if it's entering a 35 degree cooler at 60 degrees, it takes about 24 hours for those veggies in the middle to get down to 40. And that's kind of an ideal timing for cooling. You don't want things to spend a long time cooling down. Last year, I ran into a problem where my main storage containers, which starting the farm on the cheap, instead of spending $30,000 shipping a truckload of macro bins up to Fairbanks, Alaska, I was using what people call super sacks. It's these large, I think you've called them something else in reference to like Vermont compost.
I mean, I call them super sacks. You mean those, the bags? They're basically a bag with the same footprint as a pallet.
Yeah,
So
exactly. It's like a woven.
Yeah, I hear them. I'm sure there's some other term. I think we call them super sacks.
Sling bags.
Sling bags. Oh, yeah. Sling bags. Sure.
Yeah. So that's what I've been using for the past couple years to store nearly 1,000 pounds of carrots in one of those. But those sling bags, or super sacks, they do allow some kind of air permeability, but they're not like a vented container. And so I've made the mistake of putting crops like straight from the field, straight from washing. It's a warm 60-degree fall day, and you're putting them into the middle of a super sack and expecting them to cool down quickly, and it just doesn't happen. It might take a week for those veggies at the center of the sack to cool down, and that's too long. And so, when I did that, I had this disaster where all of my big rutabagas were rotting from the inside out come February, and it was a nightmare. And I lost so many large beets that year too, because I just wasn't able to cool them quickly enough, and I didn't realize what was going on until too late. So cooling things really quickly is a big thing, but also like how you're managing moisture when you're putting things into storage is important. So most growers, it's an interesting thing that most storage farmers that I spoke to, their storage rooms are too dry. So if they're going to leave veggies out in the open, if you had like a macro bin full of carrots, they can't leave them out like that because the humidity is less than ideal, and the carrots or whatever you're talking about, they desiccate, they turn floppy. And I'll add a side note here that I am on a personal mission to educate the world that floppy carrots are the best you'll ever eat in your life. They're the sweetest carrots. It's like the orange juice concentrate version of a carrot.
Oh.
Try it if you have a chance. Don't try and sell it to your customers, but this is the privilege we have as farmers.
Yeah. Well, who knows, that could turn into an important marketing campaign right there. Especially for farmers who have a lot of floppy carrots.
Totally. Yeah. So their storage rooms are too dry. And in order to in order to prevent getting entire bins full of floppy carrots, they'll take a bin liner and turn it upside down and put it over the top of a macro bin of carrots. And what that's doing is creating this kind of humid microenvironment so that you can have this drier storage room without desiccating your crops and without sealing them in. One thing you really want to avoid is fully sealing something up with no air exchange. Every time I've done it, and all the people I spoke to, every time they've done it, you have a really high chance of having a terrible Christmas morning and cracking open a full bin of just stinky goo. It's really gross.
Yeah. Because they're still alive. And is that right? Because they're still alive, and so they're respiring. So if you completely seal them, it seals in all the ethylene and carbon dioxide or other stuff that they're giving off?
I should say that most storage crops don't produce a lot of ethylene and aren't that responsive to it, but it's more of an issue of oxygen deprivation and carbon dioxide poisoning.
Okay, so we can't strangle our carrots.
Yeah, you can't strangle them. I think one farmer I said, it turns out vacuum packing your carrots is a bad idea. So yeah, they are still alive and creating heat and exchanging gases, and you need to allow them to breathe. But kind of creating these slightly vented containers is a good way to combat a dry environment while not allowing condensation to build up and allowing for some gas exchange. So like one method that I use is I'll take Rubbermaid totes or other tote bins and just pepper them full of holes. And the goal is to provide enough ventilation that I'm not seeing too much condensation on the inside of the container, but not so much that they're drying out and becoming floppy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that sort of idea of microclimates seems like a pretty important one, because over all the 18 crops that you talk about in the book, some of them, they have different needs, right? Some of them want to be warmer, some of them want to be drier, some of them want to be cooler, some of them want to be more humid. And so, because I know when we built our walk-in cooler, which is pretty simple, we put a wall with one of those plastic slat doors. I don't know what you call them, that you walk through, but it sort of like holds the humidity, because we designed ours to have a warm side and a cold side, like not warm, but a cool side and a cold side. But there's more, like I didn't count exactly how many microclimates you would need if you wanted to do all those 18 crops. But it strikes me that things like, like you said, like putting the bin liners over a pallet of carrots or something like that basically lets you create a more humid area within a less humid area. So you could have other stuff that doesn't want to be as humid as the carrots. Okay. And so it seems like that would be a trick that would be really valuable to people. And that's why you have all the criteria that crops want to be held under, right? Because that's the key. Like putting the crops in the climate that they want to be in is the secret to getting them to last. And it may be different requirements, right? You can't just, throw them all in the same room and expect them all to be happy. But that seems to me like a cool way you can create microclimates within, maybe you have one zone, maybe like us, you have 2 zones, but you really need 4 different zones for all the produce that you're keeping. Like tips like that seem really valuable to being able to make the most out of whatever storage space you have. So maybe you can get 4 zones out of a walk-in cooler that only really has 2 and keep 4 groups of crops happy. So I thought that was a very valuable part of the book.
I think it's also another valuable part of the book is also knowing when you can fudge it. When is it okay to not give that crop the perfect conditions, and is it going to last? Is it going to be okay in that like less than ideal environment? I think a lot of growers end up doing this with their bulb alliums. That the best storage conditions for bulb alliums are around 60% relative humidity and right at 32 degrees. But most people end up storing them, in the high 40s or low 50s because that's the dry environment that they have available. They're usually trying to humidify that cold room, and it's too humid for the onions, and so you end up putting the onions in your pack space or with your winter squash. And they do okay there for a time, but they're not going to reach their full storage potential.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing that I thought of while you were talking about your setup and your different storage environments is kind of this neat thing. It's a neat thing that is just a result of kind of like the physical reality of humidity, is that when we talk about humidity, we're always talking about relative humidity, which is the percentage of water vapor in the air compared to how much water the air can hold for that temperature. Whereas like absolute humidity is just like how much water is in the air. And it turns out that the absolute humidity that delivers you 32 degrees or like 95% humidity at 32 degrees is nearly the same absolute humidity that will deliver you 50 to 60% relative humidity in the mid 50s Fahrenheit. And so you can have two storage rooms that are next to each other and not be fighting a humidity battle between them if you're not able to seal them completely from each other.
Okay. That's a good point. And it just in case, so let me make sure I got this right. I mean, the way that I always visualize this is that warm air can hold more moisture. So like cold air is like a small bucket. I'm visual. So right, so it's like cold air can't hold that much moisture. And so 95% humidity close to freezing is the same as, what did you say, 40 or 50% humidity?
Yeah, like 50 or 60 at, in the mid 50s.
Okay, that's really cool. I never thought about that. So maybe you could have the same amount of moisture in the air, but have different relative humidities in two different zones because the two different zones had different temperature.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it was something that I didn't think of ahead of time, but just kind of noticed that I expected to be fighting all the moisture that I'm dumping into the cold side of the storage space. I expected to have to dehumidify the warm side of the cold storage space. But it turns out that because there's the same amount of moisture in the air, it's just the size of the buckets that's different on different sides of the room or in different spaces. That it just works out that you get the relative humidities that you want.
Yeah, that's cool. I had not thought about that either. Can we talk a little bit about curing? Curing is something that not all vegetables do need, and different vegetables need to be cured under different conditions. So we don't need to get into all the different vegetables. But I think a lot of people have heard of curing, and I certainly didn't quite understand. I knew it had to be done with, say, like winter squash and onions, but I didn't really understand it. Can you tell us generally what curing is and what it does to help prepare crops for storage?
Yeah, so what exactly is going on physiologically depends on the crop that you're talking about. But generally speaking, when you're curing crops, the goal is to protect them from moisture loss and pathogens. So they're usually forming some kind of physical barrier that's going to hold moisture in the crop and keep pathogens out. And then some of them are also changing the forms of carbohydrates that are in the flesh or the vegetable itself. Oftentimes they're switching from starches, kind of these longer chain carbohydrates, into simpler sugars as an antifreeze protection. Because as you increase the amount of soluble sugars, your freezing point will drop for that vegetable.
Right. Okay, so that's why things get sweeter. That's the whole sweeter after cold exposure, because the plant is making its own antifreeze, and conveniently it tastes good to us. Okay.
It's a wonderful convenience. Also, with tubers, one extra thing they're doing for protection is their skin setting. And I used to think that, and I think a lot of people think that skin setting means the skins are thickening, but what's actually happening is that the outer skin layer is becoming more firmly attached to the flesh that's directly underneath it. So the skins aren't getting thicker, they're just sticking better.
Okay. Good to know.
And again, that's something that protects them from damage. You can tell if you harvest a potato that isn't cured or that hasn't begun skin set, you can rub it with your thumb and rub the skins right off.
Well, that makes sense. I feel like we've talked a lot about the crops that you can grow, their stage to harvest, post-harvest handling, but I don't want to gloss over. You talk a lot about in the book about business planning. And part of the reason that I haven't gone into that is because it's very detailed, as far as I see it as a way. So, okay, so let's say somebody's interested in doing either a storage farm or just doing a lot of storage for their farm. You talk a lot about the calculations of like yield and profit and that kind of thing. And I feel like that's a little bit harder to talk about because it's very number heavy and detailed. And so I think we might be better off just saying there's a bunch of calculations in there that can help people figure out how much produce will take up how much space and how much shrinkage they might have and how much money they might be able to make off of a certain amount of a crop that they have stocked away. And another thing that you spend a lot of time on in the book is how to actually build the structure. In fact, one of your chapters is called Not Your Grandmother's Root Cellar. I think making the point that root cellars are great, but our understanding of storage has come a long way. And you talk a lot in the book about the ideal storage conditions for produce, like, temperature and humidity. And growers will just have to look up what the optimal conditions are for the crops that they want to store. And of course, for growers considering building a storage facilities here in the Northern Hemisphere, this would be a good time of year to plan and start such a building project for next year's storage crops. So you have so much specific information in the book to help people plan what type and how large of a storage facility to build. I really want to direct them there. But I also wanted to make sure and mention that this is a part of the book and just ask you, is there anything that you can say generally about the differences between an more old-fashioned root cellar and the kind of facilities that people can build today to make produce last even longer?
So yeah, talking about the difference between kind of the modern storage facilities and the traditional root cellars, I think it's important to remember that those are born of a different time period, that they were made before the age of mechanical refrigeration. And as such, the standards for veggie quality were not what they are today. And I think, for better or worse, people expect a very high quality of vegetables deep into the wintertime because modern technology allows for that. One thing, apart from their tendency to be kind of small and cramped spaces, they're not all like that. You were talking about those drive-in potato cellars where it's a fully buried space.
Yeah, some of those are huge.
Oh yeah, they're amazing. A problem with those, as far as most storage crops or many of the classic storage crops need to be stored colder than what those can deliver. And you need to be cooling them. You have a big enough harvest that you need to start early when it's warm out, and you need to cool those crops quickly. And those kind of more traditional cellars have a hard time doing that, and they're very difficult to climate control. Most of them aren't insulated against, like the walls, the ceiling. They're not insulated against the soil. And I think an analogy, it's like trying to turn a huge battleship or a huge ocean liner. That soil is such a gigantic thermal mass that it's difficult to change its trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And you can change it with mechanical refrigeration, with CoolBots or cooling systems, but it's going to take a while and it's going to be really expensive because the air in that room wants to be the same temperature as the soil, and you've got a lot of soil to change the temperature of if you're going to be cooling things quickly. I think there's a way to get around that, and one of the farms I profile in the book is Michigan State University's North Farm, just south of Marquette, Michigan, and they have a more traditional root cellar that's kind of an old grain storage space in the basement of a barn. and they don't use it during fall harvest. They have a reefer trailer that's elsewhere on the farm, and they cool that with a couple cool bots. So during harvest, they're packing everything into that reefer trailer, and then blowing cold air into the passive cellar at night, and then when it's cold enough, moving everything from the reefer trailer into the passive root cellar.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if you're going to have these more traditional spaces and hit the right storage temperatures, you usually have to find a workaround.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's where the importance of you go into how to insulate everything, and not to have condensation on your insulation and all that kind of stuff, because the technology really has come such a long way. I think even over the last decade, getting to the point with people can choose a commercial system, or I know a lot of farmers have cool bots, and just the ability to have thermostats, have little heaters that'll come on if things get too cold, and then the ability to have remote monitoring, right? So you can be, best case scenario, you're in your house toasty, and you just check the thermometer, check an app on your smartphone, right? And like, yep, okay, the storage facility is where it should be. And our ability to both control and monitor all those conditions, I think, has come a long way in a fairly short period of time. And so
I think one of the niftiest gadgets that people can go buy themselves fairly inexpensively is a thermostat outlet. I'm trying to think of the other term for them. Inkbird is a brand that a lot of people buy, but it allows you just to plug anything really into, plug anything into a 110 outlet and plug it into the Inkbird, and you can have that, whatever device it is, coming on and off based upon temperature and humidity. They sell humidistats too, so you can plug your little humidifier into the Inkbird and it'll keep the humidity where you want it. Or, if you're worried about your storage space getting too cold on the coldest nights, you can plug a 1500 watt space heater into one and have that freeze protection, because it doesn't take much in these spaces to keep them above freezing, because again, those veggies are still alive. They produce an astounding amount of heat just by living.
Okay, and so the point of that Inkbird or the outlet is that even if the piece of equipment, say a cooler or a heater, doesn't have a thermostat, the outlet itself has a thermostat. So when it goes out of spec, if it either turns that outlet off or on, and thus the piece of equipment.
Yeah, and most of them that are thermostats have both heating and cooling modes. And so you can, I, for example, for most of the winter, I'm using outside air to cool my storage space. And so I have an Inkbird looking at the inside temperature and pulling in cold air from outside when it's too warm inside. On that same Inkbird, I can plug into the heating port a small space heater that, if it's getting really cold outside, will pop that space heater on for a minute, 30 seconds at a time to just keep the room. It's just giving it a little nudge to keep it above freezing.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, you go into that in the book. If people are curious about that, they should go check it out, because that's one of the things I was struggling on putting together this interview, how to do justice to these really long technical sections that people are going to want to immerse themselves in if they are actually planning, building, and then maintaining temperature in one of these structures.
A part of the book that I'm really excited about, and we don't need to go into here now, but I just want them to know that it's in the book, is I got to have a really interesting conversation with kind of one of the technical leads at Store It Cold. And we had a long conversation about how CoolBots work and the circumstances in which they're better or worse than a commercial refrigeration system. So I definitely encourage people who use CoolBots or are interested in using CoolBots as an inexpensive option for refrigeration to check that out, because we talk a lot about their limitations and how they compare to the more expensive but more traditional forms of refrigeration.
Yeah. Like I know, our walk-in cooler runs on a CoolBot, and I know a lot of farmers who use them too. So that'll be interesting to anybody who's using a CoolBot. So, and I don't think we may not have mentioned, and it would be hard to go over it in this format, but in addition to the compendium of those 18 vegetables that you give the storage specs for, you also have a part at the end where you talk about, it's almost like mini farm tours. You talk with a bunch of different farms which I liked because, of course, I feel like everything with agriculture depends. It depends on
Yeah.
everything, depends on where you are, what your temperature's like, what your season's like, and all these other things. And so I thought that was really useful to see just how different farms, we're putting these ideas into motion.
Yeah, I think it's what Growing for Market does. That learning from other farmers is often the best way to gain new knowledge and tips. You've learned from people who have done it themselves, and so I think that was my goal with writing all those profiles up, or kind of treating them as mini farm visits. Is just seeing what other people are doing to get inspired by their methods, but also, especially for the people starting out, is kind of seeing what's possible and at a bunch of different scales. Not everybody wants to be a 40-acre farmer with full tractor mechanization, and not everybody wants to be on a quarter acre.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, to me, that's one of the things that keeps agriculture interesting, is that you can really customize it not only to your own climate, but the crops that you want to grow, the way you want to farm. Maybe you want to farm all by yourself with a broad fork. Maybe you want to do 40 acres with only one or two people, and you do want to mechanize. It's all part of local agriculture. And it's where I have to give a shout out to yourself and all the other Growing for Market writers. I feel like I'm always inspired by just how sharing local growers are. When I think about Growing for Market, the magazine, and really the podcast for that matter, it's almost like farm tours. It's like the magazine is almost like written farm tours, and the podcast is usually almost like a verbal farm tour, because it's usually somebody telling us about something that they're doing on their farm. And so there's just such an amazing spirit of sharing in the local farm community. And I'm not sure if it's that our readers and listeners but by the fact that they're local, it means they're not trying to like dominate the continent, and so or if they're just good people and are willing to share. But I'm always amazed by the generosity of what people are willing to share. And I think also, I mean, it's worth saying, I think a lot of people most of the people who are doing local agriculture believe in agriculture and want other people to be successful at it. And so, yeah, that's where I have to thank you and all that. I feel like our writers are kind of like the X factor at Growing for Market, because they don't work for the magazine. In fact, most of the writers for Growing for Market write one or maybe two stories. It's not like a lot of publications where I have columnists and things like that. We're mostly just trying to find people who are doing the best, most timely things to help out other growers and get them to write about it for the magazine. And that's actually one of the reasons I've enjoyed the podcast, because after doing the magazine now for 8 years, I realized not everybody's a writer. There might be people who are perfectly willing to share what they're doing, but they're just not going to sit down, and they're never going to sit down and write us an article about it. So the podcast has actually been a really fun way to access some of those people who are like, yeah, I'll tell you about what I'm doing, just not going to write you an article about it. So that's been a really fun way to like just access different people than we can get for the magazine.
And I'm so glad that it exists, because it fills the void of something that I so appreciated when I was coming up as a new farmer. I was listening to Chris Blanchard and the Farmer to Farmer podcast.
It's still the best. He had the best farm podcast. Yep. It's.
But I mean, you're doing great, and I'm so appreciative that you're filling that void that he left.
Yeah, we all miss Chris, but we're doing what we can in his absence. Definitely took a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, obviously, took a lot of inspiration from Chris Blanchard for this podcast. And sadly, he's not with us anymore, but hopefully we can keep up the good work that he started.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job.
Oh, thanks, Sam. Well, I feel like, okay, so I've asked you most of the questions that I have for you. I feel like, there's so many parts of your book that I'm just going to have to say to people, go check it out, because there are these, very technical sections, which they have to be, explaining like how to build a storage facility, how to do the calculations about how much of any given crop you can fit in there. But I did want to give you the chance to tell me if there's anything that I'd glossed over, or, basically, is there anything I should have asked you about, or anything that you'd like to say before we let you go?
Yeah, it's something that every farmer, so I interviewed a bunch of farmers for the book. And to end each interview, and this was probably another inspiration from Chris, is I asked them for advice that they would have for new storage farmers coming up. And I did see some patterns start to emerge. So I put together a small list of takeaways that these veteran storage farmers have for people who are interested in getting into it themselves. The first thing was almost all of them suggested starting small, that you can store a lot of produce in a small space, and there are many summertime growers who can utilize their summer coolers to start storing winter produce. I'll put a small asterisk on that, that be careful, you might develop condensation issues, but if you have like a prefab cooler or a reefer trailer, it's not something that you built yourself, you're going to be fine using that as a winter storage space. Somebody also said cabbages are a great option for starting because they don't require any special equipment. You know, they do well in less than ideal humidity, and there's no need for washing.
Okay.
Many of them emphasize spending a lot of time, if you're getting into storage farming, to think through your systems for materials handling, because storage crops are bulky and heavy, and you end up moving, you become, a large part of your job is moving heavy things from one place to another multiple times.
Pallet jacks, basically think that through before you've got literal tons of winter squash, like where you don't want them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And to scale your production to the equipment you have and vice versa, that those things always kind of need to go hand in hand, especially when it comes to materials handling, that you can really quickly get yourself into a position where you are putting a bunch of strain on your body because these things are just so heavy. And a last one, and I didn't think of this until somebody said it to me, but it's so true. And it's to understand how storage farming will change the flow of your farming year. And I think there's probably overlap with people who do winter greenhouse growing, is that if you're going to start selling storage crops in the winter, you're selling storage crops in the winter. You can't take a huge chunk of time off because there's work to do.
Yeah.
And of course there's a benefit to that, because like the goal of this is to lessen your summer workload by moving some of it to the wintertime. But it's just going into that with eyes wide open, understanding that the flow of your year is going to change if you get into this.
Right. So it seems like if you're farming by yourself or maybe with one other person, maybe doing more like what you're doing with counter seasonal farming is a way to preserve a break, right? Because let's be real, we all need one. It's really easy to burn out in farming, so don't want to set up anyone else up for that. So yeah, if it's just you or you have a very small farm, be sure that you're ready to work all year round, or do it counter seasonally like you are. On the other hand, I know people who have a few employees who have sometimes looked for off-season enterprises to keep people busy. So it's one of those things. It could be a blessing or a curse if you're trying to keep your crew, right? Because good people are hard to find, right? And
yeah,
I know
totally.
so many farmers who have seasonal labor, they go off and it's a roll of the dice whether they'll ever come back, right? So, I mean, for forever, that's always been a thing, I think, in farming, to think about adding off-season enterprises. Like my family, part of my family's from Pennsylvania, and I know they did farming in the summertime and they did logging in the winter, but partially to keep the same crew. They had work, they had farm workers, and but they could offer them year-round employment by working in the woods. In the wintertime, they weren't storage farming. But so that's, on the other hand, if people are trying to make jobs for people year-round, if they're not greenhouse growing, or storage farming could offer a complement to greenhouse growing, because most people can't grow on the scale that they can outside in the wintertime. And so I'm thinking washing all those carrots, filling up CSA boxes with winter squashes and root vegetables and stuff like that would be a great way to keep people busy all winter long without having them out in the field. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, kind of along that line of thought, I've thought about kind of where is storage farming, or in what context is storage farming a good option to help farmers who are either running into workload problems or income problems. And I think it's especially useful for the case where you are labor and time limited and not as land limited. If you're Ben Hartman and you only have a third of an acre available to you, storage crops they're not going to make you a living. They're just not valuable enough on a weight basis. and a space basis. But if you're farming 1 or 2 acres and you've got a little extra space and you can't get the summer labor that you need to crunch out all those summer CSA crops or market crops, storage farming or storage crops don't take as much work to tend in the summertime, but they do require that extra space.
Okay, so there's space extensive and maybe not time extensive. So
yeah,
sounds like it's like everything else. It's a matter of people thinking about the details and seeing if it makes sense for them or not. And so I think your first point is also a really good one. Is to start slow, and by that, I think I feel like that's good advice for almost anything in farming. Is don't bet the whole farm on a new crop. If you have a crop that supports your farm, don't bet the whole farm on a new variety. Even regardless of how good it looks in the seed catalog, start with a little row or something like that. So it seems like, it would be same thing with storage farming, right? Is read Sam's book, try it, try out stocking some of these storage crops away. I mean, you could even look at the first year.
Yeah, do it for yourself and your family.
Yeah. See if things store as well. That's a way to test. You kind of got to test out, see if your storage conditions worked. And then if things hold, then maybe start the CSA, right? Because that's the worst feeling in the world, is to promise people specific things and a variety too, right? I'm sure a winter CSA is just like a summer CSA. If people only get like one thing for a few weeks, they're probably going to get pretty sick of it pretty fast, not going to come back. So baby steps. Yeah. Start small.
Yeah. It's a huge reason, like what motivated me to think about, to first write the Growing for Market articles and then to think about writing the book, is that I was terrified starting the storage farm for the first year because I'd never done it before and I had no clue if it was going to work.
Yeah.
And I was reading a lot of extension articles and homesteading books and things, and I was just like, I can't store thousands of pounds of carrots in damp sand. That doesn't work at commercial scale. So how do real farmers do this?
Yeah, well, I think your book really is a contribution to the field in that, like we've had the what is it, the root cellar book by the Boobles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, seen advice of like, make a clamp, it's like pile your root vegetables on a tarp and cover it over and cover it with soil. It's just like, that's not gonna, pretty sure, even if the rodents don't find it, it's not gonna give the kind of produce that people want to buy in this day and age at the end of the thing. So I feel like I really love this book. I feel like it just leveled up the information that people need to do this well. And it's just so detailed, well researched. People, check out the article that we have linked in the description. That's going to give you a flavor, but definitely if you're thinking about storing produce, check out the book. It's really great. So
thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for that, Sam. And I want to just give you a chance to say where people can find you online or on social media or wherever you want people to look you up.
I would direct people first to our farm website, and the website is offbeetalaska.com. And like the farm name, beet is spelled like the vegetable.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a bad pun.
But a good name for a storage farm.
It is. I have to say that the name doesn't come out of nowhere. We live in a neighborhood in Fairbanks, or an area that people call the Cripple Creek neighborhood. And just like the bluegrass song, or from the inspiration of the bluegrass song, all the streets in the neighborhood are named after musical instruments. So there's fiddle and violin and bluegrass and harmonica and mandolin and all these different instruments. So the farm is on a street called Tempo Court. And so we're offbeat on Tempo.
Nice. Is there an actual Cripple Creek, like where you are?
Yeah, there is a main Cripple Creek. Yeah, there is an actual Cripple Creek, a sunken frozen hole in the permafrosty black spruce. Nice.
All right. Well, we don't usually do intro and outro music, or we don't do custom music. I don't know if we can get Cripple Creek in here, but that's a nice.
That would be great.
That's a nice detail to play people out on. So, well, thank you, Sam. I've really enjoyed your articles over the years, and I've enjoyed so much getting to hear about it from the horse's mouth today, as they say. So thank you so much for the book. Thank you for the articles. And thank you for sharing all of it with our wonderful audience. Really appreciate it. Excited for the impact that the book is going to have. I think it's going to inspire people. And so thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. I've had a blast.
Cool. All right. Take care, Sam. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.